Have you ever heard of smart growth or even the 15-minute city? Well, today we're going to be talking about city planning, that world of local government where those kinds of decisions have a big impact on your life. We're also going to be talking about things such as transit and the growth of urban planning in a particular way that, in fact, impacts your life greatly. We're also going to talk about housing. And in this world, you've probably heard about the 15-minute city, the whole idea that in an ideal world, we'll be able to walk to our corner store, work, and play all in the same neighborhood, and it will be green and we'll be able to take transit everywhere. But is that a dream or is it an urban nightmare?
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
Our next guest is Randal O'Toole. He's the president of the Thoreau Institute. And the Thoreau Institute is a articulate voice critiquing these kinds of policies. And Randal is an award-winning economist and analyst and author. So welcome, Randal O'Toole.
Thank you.
Randal, we're delighted to have you here today. It's interesting. Can you help us understand more about what a 15-minute city is? And I know I've heard about the phrase smart growth for many years now. What do we really mean by this?
Well, let's back up just a bit. Urban planners don't understand how cities work. And so instead of trying to make cities work better, they imagine how they would like cities to work. And then they try to force that fantasy on the public. And they're not very good at imagining things. So what they do is they look at see how cities worked 100 years ago, before everybody had cars, before we had expressways and freeways, before we had internet, before everybody was hooked up to electricity, before we had all kinds of things that we have today. And they look at how cities worked 100 years ago, and then they try to impose that on cities today. And to some degree, it's the old phenomenon where everybody wishes that they were in Paris in the 20s. And so they're just trying to recreate Paris
Okay.
in the 20s in North American cities today. But there's also this environmental mystique that cars are bad and anything we can do to get people out of their cars is good, no matter how much it costs, no matter how uh, much it imposes on people. And since people didn't drive cars as much in the 20s because they didn't have cars, therefore, if we make cities like the 20s, people will stop driving. And I call it the cargo cult mentality.
Oh,
As you may know, during World War II, the Americans occupied islands in the South Pacific, and they had landing fields and air traffic control towers and things like that. And their waste, the stuff that they threw out, turned out to be things that were very valuable to the natives because they had never seen anything like those things before, like bags or boxes or whatever. And so when the Americans left, the residents of those communities thought, well, if we build fake control towers and if we build airplanes out of straw to sit on the runways, that we'll get back all the things that we got when the Americans were here. And that's called cargo cult. And that's what urban planners are doing. They're trying to recreate cities of the 1920s, thinking that that will make people change their transportation habits and they'll take transit and ride bicycles and walk more like they did in the
wow.
1920s.
So you've really opened my eyes up a little bit that the whole notion is that we have these planners. These are people in local government or all levels of government who are introducing a lot of policies. I mean, you've touched on everything, how we drive, how we live. So a lot of this kind of makes sense. There's a lot of policies that kind of make up, would you say, smart growth? Is that kind of the general header for all these kinds of policies that are really impacting our lives?
Yes, smart growth, the 15-minute city, complete streets, new urbanism, all of these are terms that are part of this urban planning philosophy. And they call themselves smart growthers in public, but among themselves they talk about new urbanists. Uh, but they like to use the term smart growth. It was specifically developed so that they could blame anybody who didn't agree with their policies as being in favor of dumb growth.
Okay. So the use of these words is really important, aren't they?
Yes, they are. That's the one thing they're good at, is coming up with great words. If you look up smart in the dictionary, the original definition of smart was a sharp, stinging pain. And that's the definition I think they're using. They want to impose sharp pains on people to force them to stop driving, to get them out of single family homes and into apartments, and to get them to walk and only travel within, as far as they can go, within a 15-minute walk.
Okay, so I'm as a layperson, I mean, you're an expert that has studied this for years, and I've seen this certainly over the years in my own experience as a former elected local official. But we often heard phrases such as grow up, as in vertically, and not out, like as in urban sprawl is bad, and stack 'em and pack 'em. That was a kind of a crude way of describing it. That's all reflective of this way of thinking, this almost like it's an ideology, isn't it?
But well, you can understand it because British Columbia is such a small place that there's a serious risk that Vancouver is going to spread out and cover the entire province. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. British Columbia is
Yeah,
gigantic,
no
uh,
kidding.
and Vancouver has absolutely no risk of covering the entire province. It'll be thousands and thousands of years before we even have to think about that. Our population isn't even growing that fast anymore, the world population,
Mhm.
much less Canada's population. And so there's no chance that urban sprawl is going to cover up all the forests and farmlands and other lands in British Columbia. And yet they're running scared. And so they say we have to grow up, not out. Well, here's the problem: growing up is really, really expensive. And growing out, low density development is the cheapest kind of development there is. It's cheap in terms of urban services, but it's cheap in terms of the initial construction cost. A two-story building costs a lot less to build than a five-story or a 10-story building. And it's cheap in terms of operating costs.
Mhm.
Guess what? It costs less to provide heat for a two-story house than it does per square foot to provide heat for an apartment in a 5 or 10-story building.
No kidding. Well, the kind of apartments that we see in so many larger urban centers are easily 20 stories, 30 stories tall. And I guess what I'm fascinated about, Randall, is that in this kind of environment, though, are you saying that suburbs are good? I think of the famous Joni Mitchell song. They're going to, pave it over and make parking lots and all this kind of urban sprawl. Isn't that bad, Randall? Like surely you're not an advocate for urban sprawl.
I'm an advocate for letting people live the way they want to live. And surveys show that 80% of Americans, and I'm sure the same is true for Canadians, want to live in a single family home. And they don't just want to live in a single family home, they want to live in a
Hmm.
neighborhood of single family homes because such neighborhoods are quieter. There tends to be less crime, there's less traffic, less congestion. It's a much more pleasant place to be to raise your family or to have pets or just to relax. And the urban planners think that most urbanites should live in multifamily housing. And so they've done things like they've drawn an urban growth boundary around Vancouver. and Seattle and Portland and Toronto and other cities across the country, and then said you can't build outside of that. And if you want your population to increase, you're going to have to tear down single family homes and build multifamily apartments. Well, guess what? People don't want to live in multifamily apartments. Maybe 20% do, but the
Hmm.
80% don't.
Okay, but Randall, if I take the opposing side a little bit, in Canada, are we not short, or let alone in the world? Don't we want to preserve that agricultural farmland so that we can grow our food and have a future? I mean, surely you're not for just using up valuable agricultural land, are you?
Uh, Agricultural land is about the most abundant resource we have in North America. We have huge amounts of agricultural land. We only use a tiny fraction of it, about a third, for actually growing crops. The rest of it lies fallow, or it's used to graze cattle or sheep or something like that. But it's an extremely abundant resource. Forests are extremely abundant. We have more forests today than we did 100 years ago. Uh, and so there is no danger that urban sprawl is ever going to cover all the agricultural or forest lands or even drive up farm or forest prices because urban sprawl has used up some of those farm or forest lands. So we're seeing planners deliberately making housing expensive in order to save something that is extremely abundant.
I don't want to oversimplify this, but there's almost like a fad, a school of thought, a way of thinking that has operated for years across a very important profession of people who are planners who make these decisions around where development should go and what our city should look like. Um, so in some ways, you're saying that we've gone overboard. Is that right?
No, I'm saying urban planners don't understand how cities work, and so they try to impose their fantasies on other people. They've gone overboard. And the problem is that if you're an elected official, if you're a city councilor or a mayor, um, you might have people from neighborhoods come in and talk to you once a month or so, and you have the urban planners talking to you every day and just hammering on you that their policies are the right ones. They use terms like sustainable and reducing greenhouse gas emissions and saving farmlands and all these other terms that really, when you look at them closely, turn out to be nonsense. But since they're there every day, those are the people that mayors and city councils and provincial legislators all listen to.
Okay, so I think what you're outlining here is frankly, for a lot of Canadians, it would be a shock for them to hear this, that we have a whole, frankly, a team of people working hard to really limit your choices about how you're going to live, and it's really increased the cost of living on every front, from housing and so forth. So when you think of the cost of housing, then what is really driving the cost of housing, um, and what are the solutions?
Well, the main thing that's driving the cost of housing is urban growth boundaries. Vancouver has one, Winnipeg doesn't. Housing is affordable in Winnipeg, it's not affordable in Vancouver. When you draw an urban growth boundary, what happens is if you're,
Hmm.
you're an economist, you understand a word called elasticity. What elasticity says is if demand rises, will will the producers be able to respond by increasing the supply? If they are, then a good is called elastic. And in places like Winnipeg and Houston
Hmm.
that don't have urban growth boundaries, the supply of housing is elastic because if demand increases, builders can build more. They can build more really fast because they don't have to go through long permit periods. They don't have to go find land because there's lots of land available, and they can do it. And if you're in Vancouver or in Seattle, where you've got an urban growth boundary and virtually all the land in the boundary has already been developed, there's no new land that developers can build on. Getting permits to tear something down and build something else is really time consuming, and it's really expensive. They've got all kinds of fees. And so supply is not elastic. When the supply isn't elastic, a small increase in demand can lead to a large increase in price. And a small decrease in demand can lead to a large decrease in price. So housing prices become a lot more volatile. And you don't know when you're going to need to buy or sell a house. You probably will end up buying the house when everybody else wants to buy and prices are high. And then when you want to sell, everybody else wants to sell and prices are real low and you lose a lot of money. So it no longer becomes a good investment to buy a home like it was before urban planners got their hands on cities.
Exactly. So, in this context, though, Randall, this has massive implications for people's daily lives. I think of not just the price of housing, but also, I would say, or would you say, on our culture, the way we think about our future. I bumped into a young couple yesterday, and they're in the Vancouver area, and they're actually moving to Manitoba because they don't see themselves as having a future. They just can't begin to afford a home. And so they're thinking strategically, like, I've got to move out of this community and move somewhere else where I can afford it. So that impacts people's lives in a big way in terms of how they are willing to develop their families and contribute to the community, because these things have a big impact on their lives.
Yes, and it gets into everything. I mean, you look at cities 100 years ago and you say, well, where are the supermarkets? Well, there weren't any. There were little teeny grocery stores that had about 1,000 different products on their shelves, whereas today the average supermarket has 30 to 40,000 different products on their shelves. You have a lot of choice. You can go in, and whether you want to be a vegan or vegetarian or carnitarian or pescatarian, or you want gluten free or whatever, you can find it in a supermarket. But if you want to live in a 15-minute city where you can only go to a grocery store that's within 15 minutes of where you live, well, that grocery store isn't going to serve very many people, because even in the densest city, there aren't enough people to fund a supermarket within 15 minutes of that supermarket. So the grocery store is going to have maybe 2 or 3,000
Mhm.
products on its shelves. There's going to be a narrow range of selection, and prices are going to be high because that supermarket's not, or that grocery store is not going to have a lot of competition. There certainly isn't room for 2 grocery stores within 15 minutes of walking of your home. However, within 15 minutes of driving, you can probably find 3 or 4 major supermarkets, and those major supermarkets are going to have huge selection, and they're going to be fiercely competing against one another on price and selection and providing you with the freshest, best foods available. And I'd much rather live in a world where I have people competing for my business than where people know that I'm stuck with them because I can't get anywhere else.
Okay. So this has big implications on people's lives, how our cities are designed by urban planning, and it needs to change. It's interesting. One of the observations I have, and it seems like it's all interrelated. It's almost, Randall, you've opened our eyes up today about how these decisions have huge impacts, like a domino effect on our lives. And one of them I think of is the whole area of automobile congestion. Um, there's some large cities in Canada where you frankly, like, let's say we go to Toronto, where they have this massive green belt all around the city. So it's increased the price of housing. But meanwhile, you can barely travel in a vehicle anytime between the hours of 6 a.m. till 9 or 10 in the morning. And then on the other end of the day, you can barely travel between 3 to 7 o'clock. So I think of the impacts that has on people's lives. So people can't almost go to work. They spend a lot of time in their vehicle. They can't volunteer in their community because they're so busy commuting. But also they have less time with their families, and life is just not affordable. They're getting taxed at the pump, um, where half the cost of gasoline, all in the name of net zero and climate crisis, is almost dare I say, it's almost like they're on a mission to make life unaffordable and unlivable. Am I being too bleak in my kind of summary there, Randall?
I think you're right that a lot of the congestion that we see in our cities today is deliberate. The planners have decided that we shouldn't
Deliberate.
drive, deliberate. So they've stopped building roads and instead, or expanding the capacity of roads, or doing other things that'll relieve congestion. And instead, they want to put all of our transportation dollars into urban transit and bike lanes and things like that. So, for example, the most cost effective thing you can do to relieve congestion, it costs very little and it does an enormous amount to relieve congestion, is traffic signal coordination. With coordinated traffic signals, they can make it possible to drive from one end of a city to another without having to stop for red lights. And cities used to be into doing traffic signal coordination, but now they say, well, if we coordinate traffic signals, that'll just encourage people to drive. We used to see signs that say signals set for 30 miles an hour. So if you drove at a consistent 30 miles an hour, you wouldn't have to stop at red lights. Now I've actually seen signs in cities that say signals set to require frequent stops. They deliberately uncoordinated the traffic
Oh
signals
my.
in order to increase congestion. So here we have something that would be a way of reducing congestion, and they deliberately subvert it so that it won't work. That's basically what urban planning is all about. It's about manipulating people to get them to do what the urban planners want to do rather than what the people want to do.
That's a great segue to, frankly, we've got to really rethink downtowns. I think that's very true historically from certainly my own experience and observations across the country with local government. There's almost an obsession around trying to preserve downtowns the way they function at the turn of the century, and it's really not helpful. So they have to be reimagined. So if you were in charge for a day, what would you do to reimagine our downtowns?
Downtowns were built in human history for only about 50 years, from about 1880 to 1930. If you say to somebody just one word, if you say the word city, in their heads, they will imagine a place that has a downtown with big, tall skyscrapers surrounded by low rise development. And they will imagine everybody living in these low rise suburban areas and then driving to downtown or taking transit to downtown to their jobs, even though 94% of the jobs aren't in the downtown. So we have this myth of a downtown that was based on this 50-year period. No downtowns were built before 1880. No downtowns really have been built without subsidies since 1930. And so the idea
Wow.
we need to save downtowns, that's like saying we need to save the telegraph industry or we need to save outhouses.
Right.
It's not enough that everybody has a toilet in their house. We need to make sure that everybody is within a quarter mile of an outhouse. That's like saying we need to be, and the urban planners are essentially saying that. They say we need to have everybody within a quarter mile of a light rail line. We need to have everybody be able to get to a high density downtown without dealing with a lot of traffic. So they build light rail instead of
Yeah.
freeways, and we end up with more congestion instead of less.
Wow. So if we look at this situation, and it has huge impacts as we've outlined on people's lives, particularly working people, poor people, it affects our costs and our choices and the kind of quality of life we can live. What kind of action can we take as citizens? What should we be doing so people can look to the future with confidence that they can build their lives? What action would you recommend we take?
Well, the most important thing to do in British Columbia is get the Parliament to eliminate, abolish the planning laws that allowed the Greater Vancouver Authority to get all its power. Just abolish that authority, and those planning laws
So
apply to the
this
entire
is
province.
this is across Canada, right?
Well, see, I'm starting with British Columbia because it has some of the strictest planning laws in the country. And then,
Mm.
Ontario has laws that aren't as strict but are there, and those need to be repealed. I would say um, in Manitoba, it probably doesn't. In Saskatchewan, they probably have very few planning laws like that. I haven't done a province by
Mhm.
province examination, but I don't think there's any problems there. The main problem in Alberta is transportation. Both Edmonton and Calgary are focused on light rail, which, as we've explained, is really expensive and can't move as many people as buses. And to generate light rail ridership, I suspect that they're trying to get high density development along the light rail lines, which isn't the way people want to live. People don't move to Alberta so they can live in a mid rise or high rise housing project. So Alberta, and particularly Calgary and Edmonton, need to get away from this point of view and let people live the way they want to live. So it's different by province, but I don't think the federal government in Canada has as much of a role, although it did fund the Ottawa light rail and some other light rail lines, which was a big mistake. It needs to get out of that and let the provinces uh, uh, govern the cities, and the provinces in turn should let the cities decide what they want to be and not try to impose a vision on those cities.
Well said. Randal O'Toole, we're so glad that you could join us today and challenge us about our thinking around cities as well as transportation.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.